Now we're going to take a look at factoring trinomials where the a value does not equal 1. So if we're looking at the trinomial ax squared plus bx plus c, if a does not equal 1, the very first thing you should always do is check for the greatest common factor. So if you can factor out a greatest common factor and make the a value equal to 1, that would be great. But if you can't and there isn't one, you can factor by two different methods. And the first one we'll look at is called trial and error. And the second one we'll look at is called by grouping. And we're going to use that by grouping method that we looked at before, but we have to do a few things before we get to that grouping method. I call this method the ABC method. So let's take a look at trial by error. And in trial by error, we list all of our possibilities. So for example 1, I have the trinomial 2x squared minus 5x minus 3, and I would like to factor that. So I notice what I need to do is list my factors of my a value. So that was 2x squared. So how do I get to 2x squared? I need two things that multiply to 2x squared. So that might be 2x times x. Then I'm going to look at my c value, and my c value is a negative 3. So my last value, or c value, is a negative 3. So that can be done by negative 3 times 1 or 3 times a negative 1. Now I'm going to list all the possible combinations that I can make with these, putting those in my first slot and these in my last slot. So I could have a 2x times x, and then I could either have a negative 3 and a 1 here, or I could have the positive 1 and the negative 3 there. Again, I'll put 2x and x here, and I can either have the positive 3 and a negative 1 there, or a negative 1 and a positive 3 there. So this lists all the possibilities that I could have. Now I need to find out which one works. And when I look at them, I notice that this is the one that works. And so this will be my answer, because if I FOIL this back out, it will give me the exact same answer as here. And that is how you do trial and error. So trial and error works really nicely if your a values and your c values don't have a lot of factors. If they have a lot of factors, it gets a little more trickier. But still, all you have to do is list all the possibilities. Now, when you do this, and if you've done this multiple times, then you start to get a little quicker at it. You can see which possibility is going to work more easily. You don't have to list all the different examples. You can just find the one that works. Now we'll take a look at factoring by grouping, where the a value does not equal 1, and I call this method the ABC method. So the very first step, and a lot of students don't do this, but it will really help you to stay organized, so I highly recommend it, and that is to list your a, your b, and your c values. That way you don't accidentally make a mistake and forget a negative if there's a negative in front of your b or c value. So I highly recommend that you first list your a, b, c values. Then what you're going to do is you're going to find what happens when you go a times c. So you're just going to multiply a times c. Your third step will be you're going to list factors of whatever you got from step 2. Your a times c, you're going to list those factors that sum up to b. So this is really similar to when your a was equal to 1 and you found the factors of c that summed up to b. Well, now you're just going to add in that a piece. So we're going to go a times c, find those factors that sum up to b. You're now going to rewrite your equation using your new factors that you just got from step 3. And then you're going to do your process of factoring by grouping. And then you can check your answer by FOILing it back up. So let's take a look at an example. So first example, we'll do the same one that we just did with trial and error, which was 2x squared minus 5x minus 3. So my a value is 2, my b value is a negative 5, my c value is a negative 3. So that was my first step. Second, I'm going to go a times c. And my a times c is 2 times negative 3, and that gives me a negative 6. Then I'm going to take my factors of a times c, which was a negative 6, and I want the ones that add up to b, which is a negative 5. So there's lots of factors of negative 6. I could have had negative 6 times 1, 6 times a negative 1, negative 2 times 3, negative 3 times 2. But the ones that are going to add up to a negative 5 are negative 6 times 1. So I have negative 6 plus 1 adds up to a negative 5. My next step 4 is to take my equation, my trinomial, and I'm going to rewrite it. And I'm going to substitute where negative 5x was, and I'm going to rewrite that saying negative 6x plus 1x. And I can do that because that equals negative 5x. So I now have 2x squared minus 6x plus 1x minus 3. And what I notice is that this is a 4-term polynomial. And when I have a 4-term polynomial, I think, can I factor out a greatest common factor? And we already know that we can't because we've made it that way. But then I'll say, oh, but it's got 4 terms, so I can factor by grouping. So when I go to factor by grouping, I'm going to cover the last 2 terms and I look at the first 2 terms. And I say, what's common? What can I factor out? And I can factor out a 2 and an x. So I factor out a 2x, and when I do that, I'm left with an x minus 3. Now I'll cover up the first 2 terms and I look at the second 2 terms and say, what can I factor out? Well, the only thing that's common to both of those is a 1. So I will factor out a 1 and I'll be left with an x minus 3. Well, now I look at this and I say, what's common to these 2 terms? And I can factor out an x minus 3. When I factor out an x minus 3, I'm left with a 2x plus 1. There's my answer. I can check my work by foiling, and when I foil, lo and behold, I get the same answer. So here is another example. I have 3x squared minus 10x minus 8. I have a trinomial. I cannot factor out a greatest common factor. So I'm going to use my factoring by grouping or ABC method. So my A is 3, my B is negative 10, my C is a negative 8. Next, I go A times C, which is 3 times negative 8, which gives me a negative 24. I list my factors of negative 24, and there they are. If I find it right away, I don't actually have to keep listing them, but I'm showing you all the different possibilities. I want to find A times C. That's going to be equal to my B value, which was a negative 10. So I notice that 2 times a negative 12, well, 2 plus a negative 12 adds up to negative 10. I now can take my equation and rewrite it. So I have 3x squared minus 10x minus 8. I'm going to substitute where the negative 10x is, a negative 12x plus 2x. So I rewrote my equation. I now have 4 terms. I can't factor out a greatest common factor, so I'll factor by grouping. I cover up the last 2 terms, and I can factor out a 3x from the first 2 terms, and then I'm left with x minus 4. Cover up my first 2 terms. I can factor out a 2 from my second 2 terms, and I'm left with 2 times x minus 4. I look and I see that an x minus 4 is common to both of these terms, so I can factor out an x minus 4. When I factor out an x minus 4, I am left with 3x plus 2. There I am. That's my answer. I can check my answer by foiling. I did it, checked it. It worked.